Hi, my name is Amanda Sears, and I'm the horticulture agent here in Madison County, Kentucky. And today I'll be talking about the good, the bad, and the not really bothering anything. I looked at insects in the garden. So a lot of times people think the only good bug is a dead one, but really about only 10% of insects are considered pests. And so that leaves 90% that are probably either helpful because they're pollinators, or maybe they're eating bad insects, or they're just kind of hanging out and they're not really hurting anything. Today I'll be talking about ideas for control, pests, attracting beneficial insects, and then I'll go over a list of beneficial insects that you may commonly see in your garden. So does this look like a good bug or a bad bug? It looks pretty scary actually, but this is a wheel bug and he is actually a beneficial insect. He has a piercing mouth that can suck juices out of other insects. So what about this little guy? We're told often that ladybugs are very beneficial, but this is actually a Mexican bean beetle, and you can tell because it has 16 spots on its back, and this is a defoliator. And I think one reason it's so important to know what insects are which is because if you plan on any kind of control, you want to make sure you're getting the right insect and not one that is beneficial. So just a few control methods to start with. First of all, I think it's really important to scout very frequently your garden. Every day, if possible. A lot of insect problems and disease problems as well start out very small and can grow very quickly into a problem. And so when you're going out to look at the garden, look at the leaves, look at the bottoms of the leaves, at the bottom of the plant. And because a lot of these insects may be very small, at least when they're immature, they may get larger, but things like aphids love to live underneath the leaf. And if you're just kind of glancing, you may miss it. And note also the life cycles of the insect. Both on the right are two types of immature insects. And the one on the bottom is a very heavy feeder. It's actually an immature ladybug, and it's a very heavy feeder on aphids. But if you didn't know better, you might think that that was a problem insect. So it's, again, very important on identification. One common way to keep insects out of the garden is by exclusion. And one way of doing that is using row covers, which means maybe to use a low tunnel or a remay or tobacco cloth and cover the plants at certain times of the year. Obviously, probably starting in the spring before insects become a problem. This, I think, would be most helpful on plants, obviously, that don't require pollination. For plants that do need to be pollinated, you would have to time it well so that you would uncover the plants as pollination needs to occur so insects can come in. I think probably one of the easiest things to do is once you find out an insect is a problem and you've scouted and you found it, then the next thing to do is just to kill it, to squish it, to take a bucket of soapy water and to knock it into the bucket of water if you don't want to squish it by hand, but to get rid of it that way. Again, starting out, if you start out in early, the insect population may not be really high yet, and so it may not be a problem to do it this way. But as we go down this list of controls, it becomes more evident that it's going to be harder on all insects, not just the ones that you're focusing on. And so, again, if you can do it, start early, identify the insect, and then kill it if it's a problem. Oils is something that I don't talk about a whole lot, but are a very common use of control for insects, although I usually think of it more with perennial crops like apple trees. So with dormant oils and horticultural oils, they're actually suffocating insects. And so the dormant oils, they're actually suffocating over winter. I know there are some temperature requirements for each of these. For instance, you wouldn't want to apply a dormant oil during warm weather. And I don't have that information in front of me, but I'm not sure, but I think even over 40 degrees or so. So a good point might be said at this point that if you're using any kind of chemical, oils or spray, make sure and read the label so that you know when to apply and how to apply. And I do have more information at the end of this presentation on dormant oil sprays and horticultural oils. One easy control method is just clean up your debris. This is actually a picture from my garden last year, and these zucchinis got out of hand. And as I walked and scouted in the garden, I noticed that it looked like the fruit actually had like a pimple on it. And when I looked closer, there was actually immature squash bugs. Now, if I had left that, and I did get rid of it, but if I had left that laying there, those could have easily overwintered into next season. And so just removing problems this year may help with next year's problems or reduce next year's problems. An insecticidal soap, there's ways, there's formulations that you can actually make yourself with water and Dawn dish detergent. And there's also ones you can actually purchase. If you are using Dawn dish detergent, I myself have had a little bit of a problem with the spray bottles kind of gumming up as I try because of the soap. So in some ways, just buying the insecticidal soap may be helpful and easier in the long run. And these are especially helpful with soft-bodied insects. The next step would be a selective herbicide. I put herbicide there and I should have put insecticide. I'm sorry. So a selective insecticide. And that means that it's an insecticide that will just kill one type of insect or one family of insects, maybe as an example. So a good example of that would be BT. And so that's Bacillus thuringiensis. And that is a type of bacteria commonly found in the soil. And the product BT is derived from that bacteria, and it will only kill larvae that are in the Lepidoptera family, which means that they will become a moth or a butterfly when they're adults. And so you can spray it over, let's say, a cabbage plant, and it would kill loopers and inchworms and anything else, armyworms that are on those plants, but it would not kill a beetle. And so it's considered a selective herbicide. With broad spectrum, I'm sorry, I said herbicide again. Again, with broad spectrum insecticides, broad spectrum will kill everything. And so a good example of this is every year someone brings in and talks to me about their shrubs in their yard. And we figure out the problem is a spider mite. And they have already sprayed heavily to kill the spider mites, but it doesn't seem to be doing anything. So when I look at the type of chemical they've been using, spider mite is not labeled on that for that insecticide to work because it's not an insect. And so because they didn't know what the problem was and didn't buy the correct product, they've now killed all the insects on there, the beneficial, the ones that aren't doing anything, and they're left with the spider mite problem. So again, it goes back, it's very important to know what the problem is. Do not spray preventatively if you can help it. Again, going back to that's kind of something that you would do with a broad spectrum insecticide because it will kill things that are not a problem. But instead, spot treat as needed, and that would work with any of the insecticides that we mentioned. Also, know your spray before you use it. And I talked a bit about already what insect does the spray affect, or not just insects, but mites or any other problem in the garden. And when is the correct time to use that? We mentioned the dormant oils earlier. Those can only be sprayed when the plants are dormant and in cold weather. In warm weather, they can actually burn the plants. And so another thing to think of is what to do to keep myself safe. Is this a chemical that requires gloves or perhaps goggles or closed-toed shoes? And so it all goes back to read the label of the product that you are using. And I know a lot of those labels are very long and very in-depth, but they will tell you everything you need to know. Now I'm going to go through a list of very common problem insects here in Kentucky. And I have a lot of information on each slide, and I'm not going to read it all. I might touch on a little bit of it, but this is more for your information, so you have a picture and a name and some ideas. So corn earworm, very common. I think probably one of the most interesting things about corn earworm to me is that it comes in so many different colors, as you can see from the picture on the bottom. Yeah, if you were out in the garden, you might think that that's several different kinds of caterpillar, but that's all actually earworms. Stink bugs actually will end up on our pests and our beneficials list because there are different types of stink bugs. The worst stink bug that we have currently in Kentucky is the brown marmorated stink bug, and it's not native to here, but it is here now, and it is the one that gets into our houses in the fall. And what happens with stink bugs is they have a piercing mouth part that pierces into the fruit of the plant, and it can cause distortions and injuries. Colorado potato beetles are voracious eaters, and if left unchecked, can defoliate a plant. This is a very good example of an insect that would work well with going out with a bucket of soapy water and knocking them into it. The best time to do that would be in the morning when they're still sluggish. The bottom picture is also the Colorado potato beetle, just immature stage. And so with these insects, a lot of times they look very different when they're young versus when they're mature. And so that is one more thing to kind of think about as you are starting to identify problems in the garden. Cucumber beetles come in two different, well, one is spotted and one is striped. They look different, but they're both cucumber beetles. They also feed on leaves, but these insects also act as a bacterial vector for different types of plants in the cucurbit family. And so you can see actually just some of the feeding damage and distortion on the fruit on the bottom. But what happens is they do vector bacterial wilts, which kind of clogs up the vascular system of the plant and can cause it to collapse on itself because the vascular system is no longer working. And so it basically plugs it up. And you can see in the top picture some of the damage from the cucumber beetle as well, the feeding damage. Squash bugs are very common, and you might recognize that bottom picture. That's very similar. That's the same insect that I found on my zucchinis. These actually suck juices from cucurbit crops. And again, cucurbit crops are cucumbers and squash and watermelon and pumpkins. And again, going back the bottom, we're looking at three different life stages: the adult, eggs, and then the immature larva. Flea beetle damage is very common, and it's probably one of the more common insect problems that I get calls about. It's very distinct. Its damage is, it literally looks like someone shot a shotgun on a plant and has very small holes all over it. It also is called a flea beetle because it's very small, but also as you approach it, it will jump like a flea. It is not a flea, it is a beetle, but it does jump like a flea. Aphids are an extremely bad problem on garden plants, flowers, trees, shrubs. Someone brought one in earlier today on a shrub, and they're tricky because they live on the bottom sides of leaves. And this is one reason it's so important that when you are checking your garden, that you turn those leaves over and look at them to see what might be going on the underside. Aphids don't need male aphids to reproduce, and so numbers can really increase quickly. And so it can go from a problem where you can just basically crush them with your hand to potentially having to either spray a very harder chemical or just remove the plant in general. They are very soft bodied, and so they are easy to kill. If you look at that bottom picture, the close-up of the aphids, you can see a small pipe-like appendage going out the back end of it. And they actually emit something called honeydew, which is a very sticky substance, and it falls on the plant beneath it. And so if you see a shiny material or shiny seeming look on leaves or anything under the plant, that may be a sign of aphids. That honeydew can actually also become black and at that with mold, and we call that sooty mold. And sooty mold you can actually scrape off. A lot of times people think it may be a disease, but it's actually a sign of aphid infestation. The other thing is ants also like to eat these honeydew. And so if you see a lot of ants in a place where you don't think you would expect them, that is because of aphids. Wireworms are mostly problems in areas where you have recently gone from turf straight into garden, and that they will primarily only damage root crops, so potatoes and sweet potatoes. Squash vine borer is especially damaging. There's a joke about how many squash plants does a person really need because they are so prolific in the summer at times. But I always plant at least one or two that I don't, more than I think I need because of this insect. But the adult will lay her eggs on the base of the squash plant, and then the larva will develop into a caterpillar and will actually start to bore into the plant. And so it actually basically it kills the plant by excuse me, hollowing out the inside. And so if you can catch this early, if you notice that there's a larva or a caterpillar in there, you can actually slit the stem, get out the larva caterpillar, and then bury it back. Put soil or mulch or something up around the area where you cut it out, and hopefully it will induce rooting. I've never tried that. Usually at the point at which I find the squash vine, it is already too late. Cutworms are pretty common some years, and what they do is they hide during the day but come out at night and actually cut portions of the plant off and then oftentimes drag them back underground to eat. The easiest thing to do with a cutworm is actually create a little barrier to put around your plants. They're especially bad on tomatoes often. And so I took a toilet paper roll and split it up the side. And what you could do is put that around the plant base and even bury it in soil just a little bit, maybe an inch or so, or maybe two, and that will create a barrier so that the cutworm can't get on there and cut. And the various caterpillars, if you remember, I said that a product called BT, and it comes in a lot of different products, but the primary ingredient would be BT, affects caterpillars. So all the different caterpillars that would, when they grow up, become moths or butterflies. So to jump into beneficials, and there's a lot of different beneficial insects out there that do all kinds of different jobs. Some are pollinators, some are maybe they're eating bad insects. So what you want to do is, if you're trying to encourage more beneficials in the area, is choose a variety of plants that will bloom as many months as possible. And so they have a place to stay year long. And the best flowers for attracting these insects tend to have small flowers. So you can see the picture on the right, I'm actually holding a Queen Anne's lace. And although it's a large flower head, it's made up of a lot of small individual little flowers that may be attractive to these insects. And so plants in the parsley family and the sunflower family attract a lot of beneficials. Another thing to think about is shelter for these insects. And so you don't really want to leave your garden open, for lack of a better term, or bare as we go from fall over winter into the early spring. So you want to cover it either with mulch or dead leaves, or put in a cover crop in order to shade the soil surface. And then also install perennial flower beds and hedgerows near your flower and vegetable gardens to help attract insects to those areas, and then also hopefully then they will come to your gardens. And if you don't have water, pond, something like that nearby, consider putting out a small shallow container with water in it. You can put little sticks in there or rocks for perches, but I would caution you that mosquitoes can become a problem after a few days if you have water sitting out. So you want to change that water every 2 to 3 days. I'm going to go through a list of different insects that are beneficial that here in Kentucky, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, but these are some of the ones that are most common. And mantises are at the top of the list. I think they are very well known for being beneficial and eating problem insects. They also eat insects that are not problems and each other. They are just voracious eaters. And so there's only one generation a year of the praying mantis. And I think they're just interesting to watch. This is actually an insect too that they are born looking like a little tiny praying mantis. And so it's just kind of interesting to watch. We were talking mostly about insects, but there are many spiders that are also a good predator for a lot of the pest insects. And this is a very common one that we see starting in the fall. Soldier beetles, they can be seen on the flowering shrubs and trees, and then the larva is in the soil. And this is a good example of an insect where the larva eats one thing, where it might feed on small soil organisms, whereas the adults eat other types of aphids and mites and mealybugs. And so it's what we see here is it's eating one thing when it's immature and another when it's mature. Tiger and ground beetles, and they can, interestingly, some of these insects can live up to 4 years. They run very quickly, which is where they get their names. But I think the most interesting thing about them is just how shiny and beautiful these insects are. There's a lot of different insects that fall into the lady beetle or ladybug group. I mentioned in that first picture, or one of the first pictures I showed, that one little ladybug had 16 spots, and it was a Mexican bean beetle and was actually a pest. And so that is one species of lady beetle that is a pest, kind of like some stink bugs are, but some aren't. And so it's interesting just to kind of see all the different insects that are in different families, how some may be a pest and some may be a beneficial. So you can see, we see an adult, there's a larva, and then also pupa. So just very interesting. So again, going back to knowing knowing the insect before you act, before you do anything to remove anything from the garden. The robber fly is a very common insect that you see, and it will prey on a lot of different insects. And again, this is an example of a larva that feed on soft-bodied insects, but the adults will actually kill wasps and bees and a lot of other different flying insects. The syrphid or hoverflies actually have a generation every 2 to 4 weeks, and the adults feed on nectar and pollen, and the larvae are predaceous and feed on aphids and scales. There are a lot of flies on this list, which is interesting, but the arachnid fly parasitize caterpillars and adult larval beetles. Stink bugs show back up as a beneficial in this case. I think probably the most interesting thing about, well, stink bugs are kind of interesting in general, but the picture here on the right is it's showing several different growth stages of the stink bug from egg to adult. And immature stink bugs have a very interesting back and look to them. And if you looked at them and didn't know it, it very easily looks like a different insect. And so it's not a few times a year, somebody might send me a picture or bring one of those by, and just for identification, and because they are so unusual looking. Assassin bugs are kind of similar to that wheel bug in one of the first photos I showed. They are beneficial. It's hard to see, but if you look closely, they have a piercing mouth part that they actually stab their victims with, and then they suck them dry. So that's kind of horrifying and kind of an insect. Now the braconid wasp is very tiny little wasp. It's not one that we ever need to worry about, but it's very interesting because if you've ever seen one of these tomato hornworms in your garden, they're a huge pest to tomato, and they can actually defoliate pretty quick if they're on there. But the Braconiid wasps actually lay their eggs on or just below the surface of the skin on these caterpillars, and then their cocoons, and as the insect grows, emerge, and then they start to emerge and kill the hornworm. So if you see a hornworm with these white things attached to them, don't feel like it needs to be removed. If it's still kind of eating a lot, remove it. But otherwise, if you leave it there, because the Braconiid wasps have a very quick life cycle, leave it there, and then hopefully it will, the next generation will be able to affect the next hornworms that come up. And then to the left, you can see aphid mummies, which means basically the Braconiid wasps have done something similar. They've laid their eggs there, and then they've kind of burrowed from the inside out. I think lacewings are probably one of the prettiest of our beneficial insects that I commonly read about, at least. I think their eggs are very pretty because they are on a very fine filament or wisp, and then they have the egg on the end. But it's a very distinctive looking insect because of the lace looking on the wing. And they actually have 1 to 10 generations per year. Adults feed on honeydew, and if you remember, honeydew is that sticky substance that aphids give off, while the larvae feed on aphids. So it's kind of funny, they feed on aphids and then the adults feed on the honeydew. I included doodlebugs because you see a lot of those pitfalls, which is the top picture. You see them a lot, like maybe around barns and areas that aren't disturbed often. And when I was a little girl, I was told that if you kind of get down right next to the pitfall and say doodlebug, doodlebug, your house is on fire, an insect would come out. Now I never saw an insect, and judging from what the insect looks like, at the bottom picture, it's probably good that it did not come out, but it is the larva of an antlion. But it actually, so it creates these pitfalls, and what happens is, as an insect goes into that area, it'll shift some of the dirt or the sandy material into the bottom, and that is a cue for the antlion to come out and to get it. And they're voracious feeders. Dragonflies are one of, well, in my opinion, one of the more pretty beneficials that we have, kind of up there with the lacewings. But they're amazing because of the flight. Also damselflies, which I on this list, but they both will need to have an aquatic area for their larvae. So the aquatic larvae of these insects actually eat wigglers, which, for instance, mosquito larvae. So these are going to be mostly found near ponds and wet areas. And I think lightning bugs are probably one of, if you're nostalgic at all, I think everybody has at least some memories of catching lightning bugs when they're kids. And it's interesting because the lightning bug has light patterns to attract mates, and then with different types of lightning bug, they also have different lightning, so they know which species is which. And they can also be cannibalistic. If you want more information on beneficial insects, pest insects in general, the Organic Gardener's Handbook of Natural Insect and Disease Control is a really good book. Honestly, that's the book I've probably used the most in the entire time that I've been at this job. In fact, the spine is broken. And so I do think the newer edition has a different cover on it, but this is by Rodale, and it's a very good resource. Another interesting resource is through the University of Kentucky, and it is actually a list of vendors of beneficial insects. And that means that you can actually order insects to be delivered to your property or to your house, and you can release them into your garden. I've never done that, but it sounds interesting. I just wanted to give a little more information about insecticidal soap and horticulture oil, because those are kind of new concepts that we've maybe not talked about a lot before, and just wanted to give a little more information. Since I'm trying to keep this presentation short, I thought you might want to read it on your own. And then two, if you do have to use an insecticide, you want to use ones that are the least toxic possible. And so you can find lists like the one through Clemson here that does list them as the least toxic onto the most toxic. And I didn't mention this earlier, but if you are in need, if you do end up having to spray an insecticide, there are times of days, a time of the day that are better than others. And so I would probably do it very early in the morning, or actually probably even late in the evening would be better, because it'd be more or less likely to have bees in the area and affect pollinators. So Bugwood Wiki is actually a really great resource where you can find lots of pictures of insects and lots more information about a lot of different kinds of bugs. Integrated pest management is really just the process of not just spraying willy-nilly, but getting a lot of information about each pest and then integrating it into a management plan. That's just kind of a fancy term for doing your research and not and making the best decision possible. And then also I've used this website, Beneficials in the Garden and Landscape, quite a bit. It's actually out of Texas. I think they have them numbered like the top 20 beneficial insects, but it's been really good as I've done research over the years on the different beneficials. Had a lot of good pictures. So again, my name is Amanda Sears, and I'm the horticulture agent here in Madison County, Kentucky. And if you have any questions, please give me a call at 859-623-4072 or email me at amanda.sears@uky.edu. Thank you. Have a great day.